Right on.
Welcome back to the Convo Couch, ladies and gentlemen. I am Pasta Jardula, and today I have a great guest with me. I have SHAHID BUTTAR, who is running for Congress in San Francisco, the House, District 12, Nancy Pelosi's district. He's done it before, and he's going to do it again. Welcome today, SHAHID.
Thanks so much for having me, Pasta. It's great to be with you.
Man, I'm glad I got your name right and stuff because I sometimes get that wrong. I get it locked in, and after seeing you dance on the floor, because let me say this much. I saw you on the dance floor the other day at the Democratic Convention. Man, you got some moves.
That's not an unfair description. I was a DJ and a poet and an artist long before I was a lawyer and an activist. So yeah, I like to stay true to my roots, as it were.
Well, you definitely got the moves, and I understand you're into hip-hop. You got a little hip-hop going on, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, one of the things that, before I went to law school and before I engaged in 20 years of activism, I sort of came up as a hip-hop MC. And so the idea of lending particularly that sensibility to chants, like I'm so far over the hey, hey, ho, ho, what have you. My very first contributions to the movement were coming up with syncopated, electrifying chants that actually engage people. And frankly, it's one of my favorite things to do.
You have a favorite hip-hop artist? Because me, I was around for the birth of hip-hop because I love hip-hop. I'm 46 years old. I'm from Long Island, New York, and I was around for the birth of hip-hop. You got a favorite out there? Or somebody who really inspired you?
Yeah, Chuck D from Public Enemy was one of my inspirations.
Really?
Speech from Arrested Development also has been for me a really formative influence lyrically. KRS-One, Jurassic 5. There's been any number of prior voices that I've learned from and been inspired by, but those are a couple of the ones that I've been.
I'm a big KRS-One fan there with you myself too as well. I love the fact that you swing on over to some quality control from Jurassic 5. That's some classic stuff. But let's get to the good stuff, SHAHID, because I know there's a lot of stuff. I want to talk a little bit about then. I want to talk a little bit about now. I want to talk a little bit about the future. So let's talk about then. You ran in 2018 against Nancy Pelosi. There was a lot of controversy when it comes to this particular race, because if we can show the statistics real quick, this was actually a situation where two Democrats, two progressives, and on this particular show, we were a big fan of Stephen Jaffe, but two particular progressives actually split the vote, allowing Lisa Remmer, the Republican, to go on in there and win the jungle primary and go to a runoff against Nancy Pelosi, which pretty much made her let her cakewalk to a victory. What do you say to those people out there that said, SHAHID, I don't know why you jumped in this. You jumped in there late. What were you thinking?
Well, I did it particularly because the campaign that I beat to attempt to challenge Pelosi in the general election wasn't mounting a ground campaign. So I appreciate your attention to the prior campaign. I don't want to punch down and describe any of the various reasons that people recruited us to run in that race, but I ran to serve the movement and to mount a credible challenge to the Speaker of the House. Unfortunately, no one else in the race was doing that, despite, I think, their valiant attempts. And so I think the proof is in the pudding. I did only run for 3 months. I was outspent by some of the other candidates you mentioned, and I beat the closest one to me by 50%, which is to say, another way of putting that is we got as many votes in 2018 as Ocasio-Cortez did in her primary. We got more votes against Pelosi in a primary from the left than any candidate in 10 years. And which is all to say, I aim very much to not have this problem in 2020, to take second place in the top two primary and to take the seat in the general election in November 2020.
That's awesome. And the only reason why I mentioned it is because you said you don't want to have that same problem in 2020. And for me in particular, and once again, it's not that I'm just a SHAHID fan. I caught you on that Lee Camp interview, and I was like, holy cow, who is this guy? Where's this guy been? But the fact that you did finish, you had more votes than any progressives last time. For me, it's an easy decision to say, hey, SHAHID deserves a chance to go head-to-head against Nancy this time by herself. But that's not happening. Okay, what do we do? And can we expect the same thing to happen last time, since everybody's starting to throw their weight into this race?
There are a lot of people seeking the opportunity to file or to challenge Pelosi. I guess I'll put it this way. And there's nothing really I can do with respect to dissuading any of those people from filing, other than to run the most robust campaign that Pelosi's ever had to confront from a challenger. We have an air game that's stronger than any previous campaign to challenge Pelosi. We have a ground game that's stronger than any previous campaign to challenge Pelosi. I have deeper and broader expertise than any candidate to challenge Pelosi in the past. And I think all of those things will reveal themselves to the voters of the district. And I look forward again to challenging Pelosi in November 2020. And I appreciate your point about the 2018 elections providing an empirical indication of the community's preferences. And maybe that's where I'd start, that for people who might be seeking to jump in the race to potentially take advantage of a seeming opportunity with the challenge that we Democratic Socialists are presenting to the corporate leadership of the party, there's a difference between embracing unknown voices who haven't tried it before versus one that is demonstrated in the last cycle, the capacity to mobilize volunteers, to attract support from contributors around the country, to frame the issues in compelling terms that people can understand, that boldly declare the need for a progressive socialist alternative on issues from universal health care to robust solutions to the climate crisis, to a peaceful and just foreign policy that places human rights before corporate resource extraction. On all of these different issues, I think our campaign will demonstrate a very different degree of greater capacity than those seeking also to challenge Pelosi. And again, I look forward to the general election in November.
That's awesome. Well, what is that plan that we're talking about? Because if we talk to all these progressives, a lot of them, you guys have the same platform. You're all for, ending regime change wars. Most of you, at least I hope that. You're for the fight for 15. You're for single payer. Everybody's for all these same values. But what is going to separate you, Shahid, and get you over the top and help you beat Nancy Pelosi? What stands out about Shahid Buttar?
Well, so there's two different answers. I'll answer what stands out about me, and then I'll get to the Pelosi question, because it's really separate answers for the primary and the general. I think you're asking about the primary at the moment. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Well, as compared to the other progressives, and then in the general versus Pelosi. Absolutely.
Yeah. So vis-a-vis the other progressive challengers to the speaker, my work really separates me from them. No one who has ever, frankly, challenged Pelosi wields my background fighting for progressive interests across a whole range of issues, both in San Francisco and in Washington, D.C., for the past 20 years. I won a federal appeal defending campaign finance reform before the Citizens United decision unwound that era of my work. I filed the first lawsuit seeking marriage equality for same-sex couples in the state of New York 8 years before the Speaker of the House showed up to support the right of consenting adults to marry a partner of their choice. I was a spokesperson for the counter-inaugural demonstrations challenging George Bush's second selection to serve in the White House. I've filed amicus briefs vindicating the right to trial in the face of the indefinite detention regime. I've fought at the local level in jurisdictions from coast to coast, police surveillance, profiling, civil rights reforms to address profiling. I've done a bunch of work that, frankly, nobody else seeking this seat has done. I think that both distinguishes the depth of my expertise. I think it's it's put me in a position to be a more forceful, credible, and accessible advocate for the very same interests that you're right to note, many of the other challengers agree with me on so many different parts of this platform. And I think the question before the community is, who is poised to be the most effective advocate for our interests? And I think that will reveal itself. I think it's already clear, but I think it will reveal itself to people who haven't had a chance to make the comparison yet. And then to address the other part of your question with respect to the speaker, the biggest difference between she and I is that I want to represent the people of San Francisco and advance the interests of we, the people of the United States, whereas the Speaker of the House is beholden to corporations before communities and profit before people. On one issue after another, for better or worse, obviously worse, the corporate leadership of the Democratic Party is actively emboldening and enabling our criminal administration in Washington. That's true from Pelosi's resignation and concessions with respect to executive accountability and impeachment. It's true with respect to Pelosi's unilateral adoption of Republican fiscal austerity accounting rules and the PAYGO rules. It's true also on foreign policy issues, where Speaker Pelosi, unfortunately, marches in lockstep with our kleptocrat-in-chief on foreign policy issues from Venezuela to Palestine. And I think that all of those issues, in addition to universal health care, the Green New Deal, these are issues in which my platform much better aligns our campaign with the voters of San Francisco than the deference to corporate interests that defines the speaker's tenure.
What is her allure? Why does she have so much support in San Francisco? Because everything you were saying right there is just resonating with me. And I'll get into some of these issues down the road. We'll talk a little bit about your mindset when it comes to impeachment and all these things. But why does Nancy Pelosi get so many damn votes? So you look at that vote tally, and it's up there. And I think it's an uphill battle for anybody challenging her. What is the allure of Nancy Pelosi within that district?
I'd give you three words in two different issues. One is money, and the other one is name recognition. Those are both very difficult barriers to surmount as a challenger without the benefit of the national platform that she's established over the last generation and the corporate network that she's built around the fundraising base that put her in office in the first place. People sometimes forget that before she was a member of Congress, long before she was the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi was a professional fundraiser.
She was.
That's her essential qualification for office. And I think that that's not the best qualification. I don't think we should be selecting members of Congress based on how much money they can raise. I think a much more important criterion to consider is who is willing to both understand, show up for, and follow the oath of office. And I think that the oath of office as it relates to impeachment is particularly critical here, because the fact that the Democratic leadership is not pursuing impeachment is roughly analogous to just not showing up for work. And unlike the Speaker, I'm very eager to show up for my district and represent our interests, the visionary, proud values of this city in Washington. And maybe another thing I just note there, I've done the job before, even without a seat in Congress. I did live and work in Washington for the better part of a decade, advancing peace and justice, civil rights, socialist alternatives to corporate policies. I've been invited by two different members of the House to speak in House briefings to inform members and their aides about proposed surveillance reform. I've also been arrested in the U.S. Senate for an act of journalism on related issues. These are things that distinguish me both from any other candidate seeking the seat and from the Speaker herself.
Is there a clip of that, you getting arrested in the Senate over there? Or?
Oh, yeah. Code Pink. In fact, it was probably my most viral moment before running for office. Code Pink was there. They were mounting some interruptions earlier in the process. And I waited until the hearing was over because I didn't, frankly, mean to get arrested. I was trying to write a story. And I was asking James Clapper, who is the director of national intelligence under the Obama administration, a fairly straightforward question that I'll note I had asked his general counsel just about 3 months before, it might have been 6 months before, at the Cato surveillance conference. To his credit, Bob Litt, the general counsel to the director of national intelligence, he answered the question on the record. It was broadcast by C-SPAN. I wanted to get his boss on the record for a story I was going to write. And just the act of asking the question, this is at the end of a then Chairman McCain chaired hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee. As soon as even before I finished asking the question, I found myself under arrest. And frankly, no one's ever answered the question. No one's ever asked the question since. And I would love to pose it to your listeners because I think it's a revealing question, the answer to which is unsettling. How have senior officials been able to get away with lying to the public's representatives in Congress under oath about matters of grave constitutional global importance and get away with it without facing any recrimination, any charges for perjury, any they walked out with a public entourage and a pension when, in very conspicuous and sharp contrast, 6 months before I had the opportunity to ask this question and get arrested of Director Clapper, Eric Garner in New York City was killed in the street without a charge, without a trial, without any opportunity to vindicate his innocence, an extrajudicial assassination, if you will, on the basis of suspicion of a trivial offense. And so I want to contrast justice in its persecutory aspect for the politically powerless, persecuting powerless people for trivial offenses to the point of death without an opportunity to vindicate innocence, while we, at the very same time, privilege official wrongdoing, outright corruption, we invest in and reward. And I think that distinction between the predatory so-called justice for powerless people and the permissive so-called justice for the powerful is very revealing of how our system does not know equal justice. It's revealing of the illegitimacy of a great many things in our legal system. And these are some of the issues that, as a member of Congress, I aim and look forward to addressing.
That's awesome. When we played the video of you getting arrested there, that was the first time I got to see it. It's great having an awesome engineer who can pull that stuff up. That was a treat to see that. And thank you so much for doing that because, it's a serious issue. It seems like some people are just above the law and they can do what they want. And, yeah, let's talk about how we're going to break through. There are some people who say that, I like Shahid, but he has no Bernie receipts. We don't see him enough with Bernie here and there. We haven't heard him comment on it. Who's going to help Shahid break through and beat Nancy Pelosi? What progressives are going to step up with this man and get him across the finish line?
So some of the people who endorsed our last race, and I look forward to their endorsements again, and we've already been endorsed by Medea Benjamin, who's the founder
That's
of
awesome. Yeah.
right? We've also been endorsed by a labor law professor here at UC Hastings School of Law, who I've mentored since she was an undergrad. We've been endorsed by Bay Area for Bernie. In the last cycle, I was the only candidate endorsed by both of the local Our Revolution groups, the SF Berniecrats and Progressive Democrats of America, who endorsed me both locally and nationally. Was also endorsed by Vets for Bernie, by the SF Tenants Union, by the San Francisco Bay Guardian, the League of Pissed Off Voters, any number of other people. I could dig into examples, but I expect the progressive community to show up for us only because, frankly, the Speaker of the House has proven repeatedly so complicit in advancing corporate rule. And I do think that the various social movements that I've been an active part of over the last 20 years, from the movement for peace and justice to the movement for immigrant rights, the movement for police accountability, Black Lives Matter, Occupy, I've been there for all of those struggles. As for the Bernie receipts, between being endorsed by the local Our Revolution affiliates in 2018, pounding pavement on the street for Bernie in 5 different states, spending probably over 100 hours on the phone banking for Bernie, I've also described publicly part of my mission in 2020 as to deliver Kamala Harris's hometown for Bernie Sanders. And I'm very eager to do that. I do expect to contend for the Our Revolution endorsement over the next year. And I do hope ultimately to secure the endorsement of the next president of the United States, Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont.
That's awesome. Is there any other candidate you like in the race right now? Say if Bernie wasn't running, who else would you support?
Mike Gravel is a figure whose historical legacy is one that I am very proud not only of as an American, but it's one that I'm very eager to resuscitate and revive. I've said that, looking at the difference between how Daniel Ellsberg was treated during the era when Mike Gravel served in Congress and how Edward Snowden in particular was treated when he was driven into exile after sacrificing his career to do the right thing and let Americans know how our officials were lying to us under oath. I see that Edward Snowden didn't have a Mike Gravel, and it's why he's in international exile while Daniel Ellsberg is rightfully celebrated as a national hero. We need Mike Gravels in Congress. I have the sophistication as a constitutional lawyer who has gone to the bat, putting my body on the line to defend fundamental rights and the integrity of our republic. I'm very eager to follow the oath of office. And I want to make a point here. Every member of Congress swears an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic.
Yeah.
And we know that the principal threat to our Constitution is in the White House, which is to say, every member of Congress who refuses to pull the lever on impeachment is basically failing their oath of office. And I take that very seriously. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I don't take freedom for granted. I don't take our republic for granted. They are beautiful things to me that I will absolutely fight to the last drop of my blood to defend. And that's why I'm leaving it all on the field. From last year over the next to seek this seat to do the job in Congress of checking and balancing the executive branch.
Well, I don't know if I agree with you that Donald Trump is the number one problem of the Democrats. I think the Democrats are the number one problem of the Democrats. And what we saw over there over the weekend is just more of the same. Not for nothing, I'm not for impeachment. I think it's a waste of time. I think it's going to elevate Donald Trump's status. And you know what? They still have the Senate. For me, it's all about if you want him out, let's vote him out. I think the people voted on him knowing that he was a criminal. So let's just go beat his ass at the polls. But once again, I'm not.
Because I think there's a lot there that you might not be necessarily focused on, and I think the speaker, unfortunately, hasn't done her job of explaining the way in which all these different issues intersect. But I'm happy to address some of those concerns.
Okay, well, let's talk about it. Impeachment. A lot of people say, and in the public eye, it looks like you're trying to impeach a man for obstruction of justice for a crime he never committed.
Right, and I would say that the stronger ground for impeachment is emoluments, and there's an important piece.
I'm all for that, by the way. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and we should be. Emoluments, the emoluments clause is a prohibition on elected officials enriching themselves through public office. It's basically a constitutional prohibition on corruption. Corruption in its most overt 1.0 linear sense. And this is corruption, unfortunately, in which the president is thoroughly complicit up to his neck. And the important piece to grip here is we don't need investigations. It's not a fact-intensive exercise. All of the facts we need to mount an impeachment for emoluments are already in the public domain. And frankly, when we think that the Senate won't proceed to affirm articles of impeachment, there's a bunch of things to recognize here. The first is the only way the Senate will have a chance to consider impeachment is if the House initiates. Second, if the House initiates and there is a process, there will be news cycles coming out of that process, which will in turn be potential opportunities to sway Republican senators. What will be even more persuasive to those Republican senators are the legions of Democratic Party activists in purple states who will force those senators to either support the president or preserve their careers. And when they are presented with that sharp a choice, there will be votes that will slip in the Senate once we put the ball in play. More importantly than any of that, impeachment is a constitutional responsibility. Even if we conceded that impeachment was a political loser for the Democrats in 2020, which again, it is not. It is the only way to ensure that the president does not serve a second term. And it's the only way it will frankly deliver the White House to Democrats in 2020 if we pursue it. Setting that aside entirely, I would contest even the legitimacy of that consideration, because the oath of office, the responsibility to the republic, is more important than the partisan interest. The corollary to that is if we don't impeach, this House, the Speaker Pelosi effectively invites any limit, any amount of potential criminality, not just from this president, but for whoever else will follow him. It is an incredibly dangerous precedent to allow this criminal administration the historical opportunity to claim that it was never sought to be checked and balanced by the Congress. It's important to preserve Congress's future prerogatives. It's important to contain executive power. It's important to put Republican senators on the line and to put them in the hot seat. It's important to give Democratic Party activists in purple states the opportunity to mount that case. And it's important to the republic, whatever Speaker Pelosi thinks about its interests for her party.
Well, I think that the Democrats have their eye in the wrong place. When you talk about emoluments, excuse me, you're talking about you're talking about something different than what the Democrats are looking at. They're still concentrating on the whole Russia thing, the collusion situation.
All of that is a red herring.
It is. Can you talk about that a little bit more? Because I want to know about your opinions about Russia, because every single time I hear somebody talk about Russia, and going over there to San Francisco this weekend and hearing all these people still talk about Russian conspiracy and Russian collusion, it's just driving me crazy, because I feel it is a red herring. And I think a lot of times that they don't want to look at these other areas because the Democrats are guilty themselves of a lot of crimes, a lot of fraud. I mean, if we're to talk about, going after presidents for fraud or any type of criminality, we can look back at Obama, Bush. I mean, Bush is still walking around, and I think he should be locked up in a prison somewhere. So why should we start right now with this president? Wouldn't it make the Democrats look somewhat hypocritical for their own stain and stuff they had back in the past?
I think not only because this president's crimes are unprecedented. The Bush administration certainly did do things that were crimes against international law. And frankly, I would love to see some executive accountability, particularly for the vice president at the time, who was the principal architect for so many violations of international human rights laws that we fought a world war to establish in the first place. It is poignant to me to be, it's a couple weeks after Memorial Day now, but Memorial Day for me was very poignant because that was a day when we celebrate the sacrifices of veterans who established a set of principles that our leaders today have abandoned. We have abandoned any meaningful commitment to international human rights. The people at the CIA who were most involved in CIA torture under the Bush administration now lead the agency. And one reason they are allowed to lead the agency is that when Speaker Pelosi was read into the CIA's torture crimes, when she was the Speaker of the House 10 years ago, she didn't raise the alarm, as she was obligated to do by these international legal commitments that millions of veterans fought and died for. As for the issue about Russia baiting in the contemporary context of President Trump, I think that the strongest grounds to seek impeachment are the ones that boldly present unapologetic examples of corruption, and his self-enrichment through office is the example of that. The issue about potential collusion, coordination, obstruction of justice, these are all fact-intensive exercises that will require investigations. Just to press on that piece, there was an investigation. It culminated in the Mueller report. The Mueller report, properly understood, is an invitation to Congress to pursue impeachment. The author of the report has described it in that terms. Anyone who's read the report has described it in those terms. The Attorney General, who tried to spin it before any of it hit the public, he tried to downplay it by noting that it didn't identify indictable criminal offenses. The reason it didn't identify indictable criminal offenses is because the Justice Department has previously ruled that you can't indict a sitting president for any criminal offense. But what you can do is impeach them. And so the Mueller report is the invitation to pursue the lever that Congress won't now pull. All that said, I think emoluments are the stronger ground because it doesn't require this fact-intensive question. Instead, what it presents is this question of, is the president operating on behalf of the people of the United States, or is the president operating on behalf of his family and his bank account? And the answer there is very clear. And I think that's the kind of issue that will resonate even with the president's base, because the people who voted the president in, this is going back a few minutes in the conversation, but you mentioned that you'd rather see an electoral outcome here. And just to note, the people who voted the president in did it because he claimed to be an outsider. And so when faced with the opportunity to prosecute this man for enriching himself through office, those people are not going to support him, right? It's not as if the so-called base of the president is going to be rallying against an emoluments charge. What the base of the president, and this is another point, is already rallying around, whether we pursue impeachment or not, is the supposed bias that he confronts in a so-called liberal media, when we know, all of us know, that the mainstream media is itself owned by corporations and, if anything, biased very much against progressive and radical causes. But the point here is that whatever corporate Democrats fear from impeachment, this idea that we're going to poke the bear and like suddenly all the Trump supporters are going to be out in the streets, they're already doing it. So it's not as if resigning impeachment diffuses that threat. And all that is to say that if we pursue an emoluments charge, it will diffuse the president's supporters. It will engage the support of many of his current allies in the Senate. And I think it will marginalize not just the president, but the entire GOP. Refusing to pursue that track, as Democrats are doing at the moment, to instead pursue this fact-intensive exercise, pursuing a red herring, is a combination of not showing up for work, leaving cards on the table, and ducking into a punch. And I think we have to do much, much, much better than that.
Well, I think FDR said the only way to become rich as a public official is to be corrupt. And Nancy Pelosi is worth over $100 million. And I don't think you're going to see her pursue anything like that, because there's a lot from that lady's perspective. What you can see that if you pull back the curtain, there's going to be a lot of corruption that Nancy Pelosi used to put money in her own pocket. But let's talk about another issue, too, because we're running out of time. I know you got to go somewhere. There's certain issues that are important to me. What is your opinion on Venezuela and what we should do right now?
It's another right-wing attempt at a resource extraction coup. Our military-industrial complex, whose architects told us in no uncertain terms to fear it, has over decades been used in a repeated and ongoing series of incidents to plunder other countries in the service, particularly of fossil fuel extraction. Another way of putting that is that resisting the Republican invitation to intervention in Venezuela, which Pelosi supports preposterously, is critical not only from the standpoint of supporting human rights in the face of its repeated their repeated violations by our own wars for profit abroad, but also from a climate justice standpoint. There are a whole litany of intersectional ways to look at the proposed conflict in Venezuela. I go particularly back to Nicaragua, and there's a couple aspects from that history that people forget. We know from the Iran-Contra scandal that the CIA was funding its rogue foreign policy in Nicaragua by violating our own domestic laws and selling weapons to Iran. People forget that the CIA was also running drugs into U.S. cities. So I want to intersect this to a few things.
In LA, yeah.
The last time we allowed the CIA to fund its rogue foreign policy in Latin America, what we ended up with was a contrived, ultimately failed, and racist war on drugs that landed millions of Americans in a system of mass incarceration. Now, finally, many voices around the country are reaching a consensus that mass incarceration is untenable. Very few trace the roots of mass incarceration back to the CIA. And so when we look at Venezuela, we should look at it not through the lens only of wars for profit abroad, not through the lens only of corporate resource extraction using our military-industrial complex like the iron fist behind the invisible hand, but we should also look at it through this other lens of what domestic future contrived corruption can we anticipate that will come on the back end of it. Right? When the CIA was allowed off its leash to violate international human rights in Nicaragua, the abuses and the harms weren't limited to Nicaragua. They came back home. We are still feeling them today, decades later. And so I'm very opposed to intervention in Venezuela. I am very supportive of the meaningful accountability for the litany of violations that the Criminal Intelligence Agency has committed and has never been held accountable for. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running for Congress, because, for instance, a lot of people have asked me, why aren't you running for the Board of Supervisors, our county level body? And as much as I am compelled to serve my community, I can't fight the CIA and the NSA and the FBI from City Hall. I've been doing it my entire career, and a seat in Congress would give me an opportunity to escalate that resistance on behalf of we the people of the United States, on behalf of our Constitution, on behalf of this country, which I love so much.
That's one of the reasons why I support you right there. The reasons that you just spoke about right there, about what you can do about the NSA, the CIA, and whatnot. And let me give you a little bit of advice, Shahid. If you want to talk to somebody about the CIA's involvement in Nicaragua with the Contras and stuff.
Yeah.
Start with Rick Ross. Start with Rick Ross. Work the freeway Rick Ross. Because we can start on our hip hop and work our way backwards and explain everything and get all the way over to the Contras and stuff. And at least back then, I mean, I said this before, and a lot of people don't realize this now, but back then, they sold weapons to fund their little war. Now they're taking it straight out of our tax dollars with these advocacy groups. Do you know anything about that as far as like what's supporting the regime change wars now abroad?
Well, I was just going to jump, if I may, to another part that you alluded to, the weapons that went into the hands of narco traffickers from the CIA. That's why we have militarized police within the United States. People forget that militarized police didn't just fall out of the sky. We militarized our police because many cops were getting gunned down in Miami and LA. And here's the kicker, by weapons that the CIA supplied to narco traffickers. So instead of dealing with the problem, which was CIA drug running and weapons laundering, we instead militarized domestic police. And what is the result of that, right? Hundreds of millions of, or not hundreds of millions, but hundreds of Americans ending up dead every year without any weapons in their hands because they're killed by militarized police who are trained to shoot first and ask questions later. This is yet another way in which it's not just mass incarceration, it's also police violence with impunity. All of these things trace their roots back to this intelligence agency that's never faced any accountability or meaningful investigations for its serial, continuing, and ongoing international human rights violations over the last 50 years. It's been half a century since anyone investigated the CIA. There's been an investigation of torture under the agency that the public has never seen the results of. And I think these are some issues that we really need to train our attention on and select some members of Congress who will do the job to check and balance the executive branch.
Wow, man. Listen, I'd like to call you off the record and go down the rabbit hole with you, man. You got some knowledge there and stuff. There's stuff that I just dive into. I'm going to get two more questions. One's like, it's not really a fun question, but it is that time. And I start talking to people out there and I ask them questions. What do you know about the USS Liberty? Do you have any knowledge of that?
Not as much as I would like.
Okay. Well, take a look at it so next time we get on the horn, we can talk. We start talking about CIA rabbit holes and go down them. I like to talk a little bit more. I was an ex-Navy guy, so I know about the USS Liberty, and it's kind of crazy. And we start talking about the CIA and, all these intelligence groups. It gets really, really deep. And what you talked about, those weapons, how they ended back on the street, a lot of people don't understand that. They don't even know that. And they don't understand the vicious cycle that's tied into that, not only the military-industrial complex, but here comes the prison-industrial complex, and it's one big cycle of money going round and round and round, and it's all perpetrated and started off with us, our own intelligence community. So let me ask this last final question. I'll get you out of here, Shahid. Day one, Shahid, he wins District 12. What does Shahid do on day one?
The very first thing I do is engage finally in the constituent services supporting the shipyard at Hunters Point. We have a community here in San Francisco, the Hunters Point shipyard, which is the site of decades of toxic pollution by a U.S. Navy installation that was there for several decades. I should just say, incidentally, I'm glad you came home. Thanks for making it back. And the results of the Navy's toxification at Hunters Point, where they are now building hundreds of condominiums, thinking that that region is going to be the solution to our city's housing crisis. It's all built on toxic land. There was a corporate cleanup that went on for about 10 years. It was a failure. It was fraudulent throughout. And during that time, if we happened to have a member of Congress who enjoyed some influence in the body, perhaps they could have sought constituent services to make sure that the Navy cleanup and the corporate cleanup at Hunters Point wasn't fraudulent. Maybe they could have ensured some independent oversight to make sure that those condos will be safe, that region could be available for our city to develop the housing that we need. But unfortunately, our representative in Washington hasn't seen fit to do that. And one reason why I'm very compelled by the shipyard at Hunters Point and the opportunity to do something on day one there, which is writing a letter, particularly to the Navy and the agencies responsible for the cleanup, to seek the information that they haven't provided to the public. One reason I'm very compelled by that opportunity is that it intersects both the Green New Deal as it relates to our community, and not just legislation, which I'll also pursue, and not just oversight, which I'll also pursue, but constituent services, which is a baseline responsibility for a member of Congress. And the fact that the Speaker of the House, despite having all the influence in the world, has chosen not to use it to advocate for her constituents, presents to me a very profound opportunity to show up for our communities and to ensure, if nothing else, that we're not building housing on toxic land. I mean, call me crazy, but that's a no-brainer. And I'm eager to pull on that thread and see where it goes.
We got a lot of those problems down here in Orange County. We got San Onofre and nuclear waste all over the place. Shahid, we have almost a year to go before your primary. I hope we can do this again, man. This was awesome. And I'd like to dive deeper down the rabbit hole with you, talk about a little bit more CIA. I think you're a great candidate. I think your lawyer background is really going to help you when you get in there. But it's going to be a long battle. And right now you got another fan over here. And I'm going to go out there and support you. And I wish you good luck on your journey, my friend.
Thank you so much, Pasta. It means a lot to me. I'd love to do this again. It's been a pleasure being with you. I'll look forward to doing it again.
Where can we find you?
Folks can find us online at www.shahidforchange.us. That's SHAHID like David, FOR change.us.
Got it. Perfect. This is Pasta Jardula from the Convo Couch. Convo out.